Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Birgitta. I'm based in Berlin in Germany, and I work for Thoughtworks, a global consultancy. You've heard from a few of my colleagues already at this conference. And also across the last 2 days, we've also talked on and off about AI, right? And so I'm a developer by trade and an architect, and usually I work with clients at Thoughtworks, but over the past now almost 1.5 years, I realized the other day, I've been in an internal role where I can full-time just look into what does AI mean for software delivery teams, not in the sense of how can we put it into our products, but in the sense of how can it help us as a tool in what we're doing. So this relates to coding, of course, but also to everything else across that. So as part of that, I've tried out a lot of tools, and I also get the question a lot, I don't know how to keep up with this, right? The speed of change hasn't really slowed down, even though some first disillusionment is maybe setting in with some people about, oh, maybe it's not making us 50% faster, right? So I thought for this talk, maybe I'll try to give you an overview of the tooling landscape and what I've seen, to maybe also give you a better idea of what the main components are, how this works, because that can also help us find the best cases where we can use it. So basically, when I think about the space of AI tooling for software, I have like a few archetypes in my head. And one of the main ones, of course, is coding assistants. So I think GitHub Copilot and tools in that space, so things that help us code and they're actually integrated into our IDE. But there's also, the rest of our delivery tool chain. So you could say a coding assistant is an extension to the IDE, right? But there's also our issue trackers, our wikis, cloud consoles, CI/CD tools, design tools, and so on. And they're also all slowly now getting extensions that, put AI in there. Like design tools, for example, lots of organizations are using Figma, and they are putting in AI features that, from what I've seen, it's almost like, when we're getting suggestions from something like Copilot, designers can get stuff like that in their design tools as well. And then I have like a more vague bucket, other tools that help us beyond coding, right? So for any task related to code, I would always recommend using a tool that actually integrates into your IDE, but there's all of these other things, right? Like requirements analysis, architecture, tasks that we do, design, ideation, research, and so on. So there's like I've also been looking for tools that help us specifically with that. And in reality, like roughly adjusted for size in terms of the maturity of tooling and also the current adoption, I would say it looks something like this. If not, the coding assistant bucket is maybe even bigger. So we see a lot of clients who have now started using coding assistants like GitHub Copilot. We're seeing a lot less of these like other extensions to your existing delivery toolchain, so the yellow part. So that is in part, of course, because we have to wait for vendors of those tools to actually put reasonable features in, and that is kind of like going a bit slowly. And then in terms of other tools that help us beyond coding, things like requirements analysis or software delivery specific tools, there's actually also not that much out there yet. So you can do a lot of things yourself by just like prompting a tool like ChatGPT or Claude, but there are actually not that many things out there that I've seen that are interesting that help us with that. And so because of this distribution, I will mostly talk about coding assistants today, and also because of the audience, because I made the assumption that that might be what you're most interested in. But just as 2 quick pointers before I move to coding assistants, in terms of extensions to our delivery tool chain, something to watch out for in I think next week or so, Atlassian is going to make some announcements about a lot of new AI stuff in Atlassian, and because that's something that is very, very widely used in the industry, that might be something you're interested in looking out for, so things you can then do in Confluence and in Jira. And the other thing is, and I'm going to have this in my link list in the end as well, we recently published an article where we used AI for requirements analysis and walked through that a little bit, also what you would expect, like what would that make that better, what worked, what didn't work, and so on. So that's going to be in the link list in the end as well. But the big bulk of this talk is going to be about coding assistants or anything related to AI helping us with code. And I'll very quickly first recap again what most of you will know, what the core features are. One is this inline suggestions, right? So while we're typing, we're getting suggestions. So the first one here, I'm typing a comment and it's giving me an interface suggestion, and the second one is actually suggesting like a bunch of code for me to implement a function. So this is usually, I find this very helpful when I have a plan, I know what to ask for, I know how to get started, and it's kind of like filling in the details for me. And it's of course especially nice when it's filling in details that are even more helpful than what the IDE can already suggest for me anyway, right? Because not to forget, the IDE already has also gotten quite good at helping us along as we're having a plan, right? It also can help with getting different implementation ideas and stuff like that. Then the other thing is the chat, right? But also a mix of those two. I don't know if all of you already know that quite a few coding assistants, this is from GitHub Copilot, now also have this little like inline chat feature. So where you can open a little chat in the editor. Henrik was also showing that yesterday in his talk, and give your instruction, and it's actually giving you a diff to the code that you're changing. So in this case, I was filtering a list of file names, and I wanted to exclude the README file name, and I'm actually not as familiar with Python syntax, so it was really useful for me that it could suggest that to me. And the point about the chat in general, not just this inline chat, but the chat in general, is the difference to using something like ChatGPT, of course, is that it's integrated into the IDE, so it actually has access to a certain extent to our code base. So here's an example. The details don't matter, but I have a CSS file open, and I was asking in the chat to help me fix like a layouting problem, and it could see my CSS file and could make suggestions, right? So that's this integration is the biggest difference, and it's actually really powerful. And of course, you also don't have to do the copy and pasting. And this part is actually, I think of this as like a Swiss Army knife, right? So clients often ask like, okay, which tool can generate tests? Which tool can explain code? Can it generate diagrams? Can it create documentation? And usually everything that you can do with an AI-backed chat, you can also do with a coding assistant in theory, right? Like we'll get to like a bit more advanced things that some of these tools do on top of that. But in theory, when you have that integrated chat, you can do all of those things, right? So just to give like a few examples, this is some stuff from one of our teams who told me, yeah, we use it for stuff like creating new classes and components, creating SQL queries, understanding a cron expression, generating stubs, creating new classes and components, which I already said, creating test data. So these are like some of the very common things. But then the power of this like Swiss Army knife is also that it can help us with all of these things that we would never build a tool for, that are kind of like ad hoc throughout our workday, right? So that's really powerful. And here's also a few additional ideas for how this can now help us build these little throwaway tools that otherwise we would never have built, right? Or do things like a colleague of mine recently shared that they transformed a bash script into a more user-friendly CLI, right? Or then we had a discussion about how we often lament that we always build all of these bash scripts instead of using a better suited language because that's what we're familiar with. But what if now we have a tool that actually helps us do this in a different style faster, so we don't always have to fall back to what we're comfortable with, but we like have more opportunity to not just to do the right thing. So in some other examples of building little throwaway tools, like somebody shared in our internal chats about building a browser extension to test a tricky bug, so they could actually give that to a user to give them some more data about a network problem, building a quick visualization over data that you don't have visualization code for. So, and then often you throw these things away later, right? Or what I also often do is like finding out if a technology has which technology has a hard to Google feature, right? Sometimes features have kind of like, I don't quite know what the name is of the feature, and it's kind of generic words, and then it becomes hard to Google. And when you use a chat tool like ChatGPT that has access to the internet, so can do live searches, then I often find the right page and documentation that tells me if this tool can do that or not. So even though a Swiss Army knife is not perfect, right? Like the corkscrew might be a bit shitty, but it can often get us 70% of the way there, and we don't have to go and get the proper corkscrew or buy it or research what the best one is. So it's basically the core features, right? The inline suggestions and integrated chat, and most of the coding assistants out there have those. That's like the minimum. The next thing to look at with the coding assistants is the model choices, right? And apart from which model it is, there's also where does it come from, where is it hosted, right? So a lot of the tools have used models that are actually, or actually not many of them. Some of the tools, it's actually relatively rare, the vendor is creating their own model, right? So that would be something like Tab9 or Codium. They actually have models that they trained themselves and that they're also hosting. You can also self-host some of this. There are a lot of tools where you bring your own keys, so you give it an OpenAI key or you give it an Anthropic key, and then it connects to those services. And you can, of course, also run this with models that run on your machine if your machine is powerful enough, right? And so things to think about when thinking about these different options is, of course, like how useful is the model for coding tasks. Henrik was also talking about that 2 days ago, and I would agree with what he said, that GPT-4 and Claude Sonnet are the models that I also use the most and that I hear the most positive experiences from. I've used a bunch of models locally as well. That has usually not been so useful. Like, it might get better in the future, but I usually gravitate back to the models that use them, to the tools that use the more powerful models. So it can really make like a huge difference in how well this helps you. The second question, of course, is where does my data go, right? That's like, so you should always, when you experiment with these tools on your code bases in your organization, make sure that, you know, everybody in the organization is okay with your data going to whatever model service this is sending to, right? So if this is like a sensitive thing in an organization, they would have to think about something like self-hosting or who they are contracting with to get model access. How much money do I want to spend on maintenance, right? Self-hosting sounds good from a data confidentiality point of view, but of course then it's like a lot more effort. There are some tools like, again, Codium and Tab9 who offer you self-hosting options where you can run all of the backend and model infrastructure on premise. So they've done some of the work, but then you still have to run it. And a frequently asked question I also get is, oh, can I fine-tune the model with my own code? I cross this out because I don't think this is a very relevant question, and I'll get back to that in a few minutes in my next section. So those are a few of the like core questions to ask. For you as like developers, you know, the most important one is how useful is the model for coding tasks? So in the next section, I want to talk a bit about what else is going on in these tools beyond the model. So how does the tool actually create additional context for the model about what we're doing, so we don't have to type out every single thing that's going on in our context. So the first one is context of the current code base. I don't know if that's readable in the back, but so this is an example again from GitHub Copilot where you can say at workspace and then ask a question about your code base. So this is basically something that also most of the coding assistants have now, where they build an index of your code base locally in your IDE. And then when you ask a question, through that index, they have more powerful means to find out which are the relevant pieces of code to answer this question. So you can see here a little bit as well. So it says collecting workspace structure, deciding which information to collect, and then usually you can also see which files it deemed relevant to your question. So here I'm asking, where am I calling the Jigsaw API, which is an external API I was calling here. So this type of thing, like an unfamiliar code base, I don't quite know where this feature is implemented. It's usually pointing me in the right direction. It's not always exactly the right place, but it helps me navigate faster in unfamiliar code bases. And so what's happening here is basically, like I said, the AI tools or coding assistants are much more than just the model, right? So this is also something to keep in mind when you think about the drawbacks of models, of large language models, that I'm going to talk about a bunch of things that can actually work with the large language model to mitigate some of those things, right? So what is basically happening is your coding assistants plugin to the IDE is composing the prompt that is ultimately being sent to the model, right? And there can be quite a few powerful things that can happen when you compose that prompt. Some of you might recognize this. This is basically retrieval augmented generation, right? So a coding assistant plugin is also doing retrieval augmented generation over your code base and a bunch of other things. Here's a screenshot from the tab 9 documentation. You can probably not read that in the back, but they're basically listing a bunch of things that they're taking into account when they're composing these prompts, like project metadata, Git history, other project files, runtime errors, imported libraries, open files, compile errors. So there's like a whole bunch of information in the IDE, right, that these tools can draw on and actually send that information to the model. And the better a tool is at picking the most relevant things for the thing that we're working on to send to the model, the more useful it is, right? But as you can imagine, it's also not trivial to do this, right? And so how well these tools can do that is a big factor of which product is better than another product. So that was about our current code base that we're working on. But a lot of them are now also offering ways to access directly from the chat and the coding assistant context to all of your code bases, right? Where you would have, let's say you're on GitHub and have all of your code on GitHub. Then if you use Copilot Enterprise, which is like an extra level and is more expensive again, you can actually get like an index of all of your code bases. And when people are asking questions in the code, they get access to that code source as well. And here's a few other examples. I'll have an overview slide of the tools I'm mentioning later, but here's a few other examples of tools that do that, like Cody from SourceGraph, Codium and Tab 9. And so if you want that, it's good to check which Git hosting providers they support as integrations to index really all of your code base. So this can make suggestions for your code and your organization even more specific to that. And so that brings me back to that question, what about fine-tuning? Yeah, and so this slide is inspired by a slide I once saw created by the folks at Tab 9. So, and basically, with some of the things that I just mentioned, this retrieval augmented generation part, you can already create a lot of value that makes suggestions more specific to your code base. And then when you're up here and then say, oh, now I also want to fine-tune the model to my own code, they actually say it gives you only like a little bit of extra lift. They actually do offer this feature for people, for organizations where this is relevant. But they're saying that to really fine-tune it in a way that it would make a dent, you need a lot of code. The code needs to be specific enough, like different from the training data, so that it can make a dent. And also, I mean, you also still have to think about that code that you would use to fine-tune it. How good is it actually, right? So the products that offer this fine-tuning feature, they often also offer consulting to help you figure out if you should do that and how you should do that. But it's like a lot of work and expensive, right? And you can already get quite a long way with the retrieval augmented generation part that the tools offer. And then in addition to code, there's also all kinds of other information sources that we have, right? I was mentioning the wiki and Jira and all of those things before. So there's this concept in coding assistants called context provider. I've seen it called in a few places. This is like a space where we're still figuring out the terminology for some of these things, right? So context providers are basically, I have a few examples here on the slide from a few different coding assistants. So you can see here, I told you a common one is the current files, right? So you can also specifically point to files in your workspace if you already know this is the relevant code. You can point to whole folders. You can provide web pages and say, you know, there's information on this web page that's interesting, and then it will index that on the fly. It will, you know, you can provide library docs in some of the coding assistants. Continue here, which is an open source coding assistant, even has configurable things for like the file tree, and they're also trying integration with Jira. Terminal is a common context provider. So those are all ways to like more specifically configure this. And there's actually like a whole ecosystem emerging where companies are actually offering context providers that you can then address in your coding assistant, right? So for example, there's a Copilot extension where you can say at Azure and then connect it to your Azure infrastructure and then ask questions about that infrastructure in the context of your code, right? So, and it's right there in your IDE as well. Or I was talking about Atlassian before. They are also now integrating with more and more coding assistants where you can say at Atlassian and then pull in Confluence documents, the current Jira ticket that you're working on, and so on. And there's like Copilot, for example, has started this program called GitHub Copilot Extensions, where companies can provide these types of bots. Yeah, so it looks very much like a Slack bot. Yeah. Or instead of one by one integrating these context providers, there are also some products that kind of give you all in one, right? So here's one example of that, a product called Unblocked. So they basically let you point it to your code, if it's on GitHub, for example, Confluence, Jira, Slack, Google Drive, like a bunch of these things. And then they build one big knowledge graph out of all of that information, and then make that available to you for a chat, for example, to ask questions. And what I also find interesting about this, they really try to enrich this knowledge graph in a way that it's not just random text information, but they also try to see, can we categorize things here? For example, one Confluence page might be about coding conventions, and another one is about the product vision. They're relevant and very different tasks, right? So they try to find ways to enrich the knowledge graph in a way that this can be used well in retrieval augmented generation. The screenshots down here, like that are probably not visible in the back, they just show, like, they also have a IDE extension where when you're in a source code file, it pops up on the side automatically the pull request discussions, for example, which some other tools can do as well, right? But or like these Confluence documents might be relevant, right, while you're scrolling through the file, which is interesting to see if how useful that is. And we have at least one client evaluating this right now. This, of course, means that you have to send all of that data to this third party, right? So you have to think about the confidentiality implications of that. So I think that much of the coming improvements will actually come from this type of tooling, not necessarily from the models, right? So of course, you know, bigger context windows or maybe models that are even more specific to a particular language and coding in that language, that might all help. But I think the bigger jumps will actually come from this tooling and not necessarily from the model. And so finally, I like a few more features. So you can also, in some coding assistants, you could provide custom instructions. Henrik was also showing that in Cursor 2 days ago, for those of you who are here. There you can, for example, provide rules for AI. So that basically means every time they send a request to the model, they include these things, right, if you have certain conventions. So as examples here, they give always use functional React or never use unwrap in Rust, which I don't know what that is because I've never written Rust. So if I was joining a Rust team, this might be useful if the coding assistant knows that and can help me consider that. Or always output your answers in Portuguese, right? So there's like a big thing there as well with large language models that can help it easier for, make it easier for people who don't speak English as well, which is such a dominant language in coding. And then another thing that's kind of similar to that but different. So there are some tools, and here's an example from Continue, where you can put prompts into your workspace and then make them accessible as commands in the chat, right? So what I did here is an example to maybe give one example after all that is not related to coding directly. What if we had a prompt in our workspace that helps us write a good architecture decision record, right? Or helps us think through a decision, right? So, for example, I played around a bit with some prompts that really nudged me to think about the why. Yeah, but why do we need this feature? Why do we need this to nudge me in that direction? And then you can have that available here as like a shortcut, and I can provide my input, like here it's actually like I don't have an existing decision record, but just we have to decide for a new front-end framework, and then it would go and execute that prompt for me. So somebody who knows a lot about decision records and what good practices are could write that prompt, and then everybody in the organization could use it there. Actually, by the way, in this case, like I didn't put the whole output. The output in this case was not very useful, and I was using a local model that wasn't very good at this, right? So it's another example of the model also matters, especially with these things where we want to try to get the model to air quote think or reason. So that is something that models like GPT-4 and Claude can do much better than a lot of the others. So in the next section, I want to talk about a few things that are kind of already here, and you have features for those in certain tools. But I'm not quite certain yet how well they will actually ultimately work, and they often don't work that well yet. And but if we can get AI to help us with them, then that would be a really big deal. So the first one is testing. So a few thoughts on generating tests with AI. The first one is that there are actually coding assistants that specialize in test generation and test improvement. And one of those is Codo. They actually just renamed themselves. They were previously called Codium without an E. I was mentioning a Codium before that had an E in the name. So maybe to avoid some of this confusion, they just renamed themselves to Codo. And they are fully focusing on how can we help developers write better tests, and not just faster, but also thinking about, what is the relationship to coverage? Can we somehow relate those two? How does this increase coverage? And are the tests actually effective? And so they're thinking through all of those things. So I think it's definitely a tool to watch. Another thought on generating tests is that AI is actually great for brainstorming which tests I might want to write, right? For edge case scenarios and stuff like that, and also for coming up with test data. I've used it a lot for that. But I think it's risky to just let AI write all the tests, right? So I think we need to maybe rethink our testing practices and see now with AI there and being so tempting to just use that to generate all of our tests, how can we really take advantage of it, but also do it in a safe way, right? So I'm thinking about things like when you have a new function, maybe you test drive it first, you are actually in control, you write the test, but then you let AI later help you generate edge cases and stuff like that, right? So I think we should, as a profession, come up with a good way to do this and not just, let's generate all these tests and maybe they don't even fail when something goes wrong, right? So that all of these things to think about what a good test is. And finally, a question we often get is, we have this old code base here that doesn't have any unit tests. Can we now just go and generate unit tests for it? So this won't work, because usually that code, if it doesn't have unit tests yet, is not testable. So I actually just wrote about that, will also be in my linked list. I walked through like a really old code base and wanted to add tests to it, and that part of the code base didn't have tests yet. And I ran into all of these like things where, it was like a big network of input objects, and I kept running into null pointer exceptions. It was super hard to set up the mocks and to set up the test data. So I'm pretty sure that for 99.9% of these untested code bases, this won't work, unless you refactor them first. The second area where it would be cool, but it's kind of not there, is solving larger problems, right? So what if you could give AI a ticket, and then it makes a plan for us, and then it generates code, right? And whereas right now, we're mostly going in small steps and line by line, and it's filling in the blanks for us. So this is, of course, the space of agents. That's like the hot topic right now. It's also called like developer agents or software engineering agents. I again listed a few of the tools, not all of them, that actually offer this. So Copilot has this thing, Copilot Workspace, which I think is still in private beta. Codo has a beta feature for that as well. Tab 9 just announced an integration with Jira, implementing Jira tickets that I have not tried yet. And Amazon's Q Developer also has an agent feature like that. So they're often in preview, marked as experimental, and they often are advertised as these generic things that can ultimately save any problem for us, right? But yeah, they don't work. I mean, I always put yet question mark because we get surprised so much by AI, but I'm also skeptical that they will actually be able to fulfill this promise of, here's an agent that can like solve any problem for you up to a certain size, right? But I do think there might be something there for a certain category of tasks that are kind of like not automatable by proper software, but also, not too complex. And I actually just experimented with that a little bit. Again, it will be my linked list. So Martin Fowler provided me with a space on his website to write a bunch of memos about things that I'm trying out. So it's in that list of things. And I actually tried to build an agent that migrates tests from the enzyme testing library to the React testing library, which is something that a lot of teams are doing right now. And if you also want to learn a little bit about how agents work, that might also be a useful read for you. So yeah, I'm quite skeptical about agents. So the next category is code review and refactoring. So coding assistants are actually today much better at adding code to our code base than changing and improving code, right? So there's a really good paper by the folks at CodeScene, which is a code quality product. And they have like a huge database of code smells and a lot of experience with that. And they send like a whole bunch of code smells to different models, including GPT-4, which is one of the most powerful models, and asked it to refactor it. So asked it to make this better, so remove the code smell and keep the behavior the same, because that's the definition of refactoring, right, Martin? Yeah. And so here's a quote from that white paper. We find that existing AI solutions only deliver functionally correct refactorings in 37% of the cases. So that's like more than 60% of the time it failed. So bear in mind that this was them sending this to a model with no extra tool in between who would maybe do extra things and would be able to filter the results that don't make sense, right? But they found little things like, you know, a Boolean expression was turned around and you don't quite see it, you know, like dangerous stuff like that. But also in the paper, they are talking about ways that they tried to make these results better, or rather, like I just said, like filter out the duds, right? The things that don't make sense, so we as humans don't have to do that. So there is like ideas out there how to make these things better in between the user and the model with the tooling. And we also recorded a podcast with Martin and also with Adam, one of the co-authors of the paper that you can watch or listen to on the Thoughtworks Technology podcast. And so I was saying that coding assistants are much better at adding code today than at changing existing code. And there was a really highly, like a study that got a lot of attention earlier this year from GitClear, where they looked at code bases and kind of looked at around the time when more people started using coding assistants, which is around here, I guess, and put up the hypothesis that, so you can see here, so this is the line for how much code was added, is going up like this. How much code was moved is going slightly down, and churned is kind of like code that gets changed, right? So, and the hypothesis here is that our code bases seem to be growing faster potentially with the use of coding assistants, because it's so easy to add new code and the AI doesn't help us well yet at refactoring, so it's easier to add code instead of refactor the existing code, right? So this is something maybe to monitor when you're starting to use coding assistants. Is this happening to you? It's not always a bad thing, could have other reasons, right? But this could also be mitigated if AI would get better at helping us with improving code, right? Which seems a little bit more in the future than in the now. Yeah, and then the final, the second to last, I think, use case I want to talk about is people ask about, can it help us with generating documentation? And sure, AI can generate documentation for us, but then we also have to keep that documentation up to date, right? So the thing that I find much more interesting is how can we even further unlock this idea of code as knowledge or code as documentation? Because ultimately, the code is the thing that is always up to date, right? So what validations are being done before posting daily transaction records into our transaction master file would be like an example like that. And I showed you an example before of how in Copilot I can just say add workspace and ask questions like that, and I can do that in most coding assistants. But what if a non-coding person could also ask these questions and not be sent to a place in the code, but actually get an answer about how this validation currently works in our code base, right? So what if we could make that even better? And there's recently an article that some of my colleagues published this that is about that in the context of legacy modernization. And what they're basically talking about is taking the code, so the abstract syntax tree, and loading that into a knowledge graph, and then also enriching that knowledge graph with either additional information or with already asking an LLM to give us natural language summaries of this code. And then they found that if you make this knowledge graph the basis of a retrieval augmented generation, that a human can ask questions, or you use it to generate a report about a COBOL module, for example, they found that in the COBOL example, this generated report was actually good enough to replace the work of reverse engineers sifting through the COBOL code for multiple weeks to describe for other humans what the code does. Approaches like this can significantly accelerate reverse engineering like that for legacy code bases. It could also improve staff mobility, right? If it's easier to get into code bases that are unfamiliar with for us, and if we can make it useful enough for non-coding team members, that could also be a big deal, because imagine a product owner or somebody writing user stories who doesn't always have access to the technical folks on the team to ask them questions about how the application currently works. If they could ask these questions to the code and then make stronger assumptions while they're writing their user stories or thinking about their features. It might not always be right. This is still not about totally eliminating hallucinations, but it's always about, like, if it can get us 80% there, is that better than what we have today? And then finally, let me see how much time I have. Yes. Finally, I just want to also mention an example that I find quite cool, but that I also haven't quite seen work well yet, just in the things that I've tried. So this is from the Cursor IDE that has like a debugging feature. So when I have like an error in the terminal, I can start this feature, and then it has this type of prompting that triggers this chain of thought type, again, quote unquote, reasoning in the model about why this error might be happening, right? So in this text, it was like a Maven error, because that was the easiest way I could think of to trigger an error. So it was doing things like, oh, looks like this is related to the following thing. To debug this issue, we need to locate the relevant POM.xml file. And then it actually went and read the POM.xml file and was looking for the thing that it thought might be the reason why this error is happening. And then it found, oh no, this is not the problem. So let me think about what else could be the problem. So it was going kind of into this chain. It ended up in an endless loop at the end. It didn't quite help me. Maybe this would have happened to my brain as well if I had looked into this Maven error. But I just find this use case really interesting if, you know, if we can get that to work. So as promised, here's an overview slide of kind of like the cast of main characters that I have seen. There's lots of more tools out there, but this is just a snapshot of what I have seen. So the leader right now is definitely GitHub Copilot. This is the widest adopted coding assistant at the moment. I think of the clients that we have that have coding assistants, probably 95% of them use GitHub Copilot. I think GitHub has the advantage that a lot of organizations already host their code on GitHub, so they don't mind sending snippets of code to GitHub because the code is already there, right? So that's one. And it's also just like a good product. It's very solid. I keep going back to using it because it works for me. Then here's a box that I titled The Other Two. So if we see GitHub Copilot as the Microsoft product, then there's, of course, Amazon and Google also have products, Amazon Q Developer and Gemini Code Assist. But to be honest, they feel very kind of like rushing to catch up right now. And I would say they don't, there's still quite a way to go to catch up with a product like GitHub Copilot. I mentioned Tab 9 a few times. So Tab 9 is basically the original. It's actually a product that's even older than GitHub Copilot. So that's why it's also, next to Copilot, one of the more mature products in the market, because they've been around for a while and have had a chance to really like improve the tool. The developer favorite, I would say, is Cursor. That was also the one that Henrik used 2 days ago in his talk, if you were there. And yeah, this is just like really popular among developers. They have a lot of interesting features that, like the debugging feature I showed you before, it might not quite work yet, but in Cursor, you can find a lot of these like new ideas and can try them out and see how it works. And also just like the user experience is really great. So yeah, Cursor, if you're allowed to use it, is like a great option. And also, I also have to mention JetBrains AI. So I labeled this as the IDE expert, right? So the JetBrains products are already really, really good at helping us generate code, right? So I'm looking forward to see how they will find ways to combine the AI with the things that we already have. Because I was also talking to Trisha G and some people yesterday about that. Trisha was giving a talk yesterday about IntelliJ and the different features that can help you there, right? Like, where is this line between like things that the IDE already helps us with in a great deterministic way that maybe now developers are being lured away from and starting to use a coding assistant for, right? Like, how do we find the right task that we should use non-deterministic, but, you know, AI for, and where should we further invest in just learning how to properly use IntelliJ because it's already such a powerful tool. The open source leader, I labeled this one Continue. So this is an open source plugin that you can plug into lots of different models. I use this one to test local models running locally on my machine. I just recently talked to an organization where they decided to trial using Continue and plugging it into Claude running on Bedrock and see how that works for them, also in terms of cost. If you want to dive deeper into how coding assistants work, you can actually look at the code for this one, right? So that's Continue. I mentioned Unblocked. I would call them the librarian. They're trying to create an AI librarian for us, right? And then finally, Codo, I would call maybe the confidence booster because they're really trying to look into how can we use AI to improve our confidence in the code through tests and stuff like that. And what all of these characters have in common, I also wanted to introduce a metaphor for coding assistants, is that, you know, you should think of them as a teammate who is eager to help, very well read but inexperienced. So for the Dungeons and Dragons players among you, like very high intelligence but low wisdom. They're often stubborn because the models really, you know, they sometimes don't want to budge from what they originally said, and they won't admit when they don't know something. So they like always try to please us, right? So you should think of them as this type of team member, the same way you might have ideas about your other team members in your head about when you trust them and when you don't trust them, right? And some final thoughts. So really try to understand the basics of how this works. In particular, this differentiation between the model, what the model does, and what the tool does, right? And when you choose a tool, also think about what is the heavy lifting that it actually does for me on top of the model. And just, yeah, also understand what large language models can do. That was 2 days ago in the talk. There was a question about, can you switch off the animation, right? When we are in ChatGPT and it shows us all the text, right? And we can't switch it off, but then we will still have to wait for 10 seconds until we see the result, because what we're actually seeing is the model is live predicting what is the next token. So it really shows us it's not looking at the big picture of our code, of the design. It doesn't understand the structure. Our tools understand the structure, so we should see how we can combine the two. Number 2, embrace that AI is terrible software. This is a quote from Ethan Mollick, who wrote a really great book called Co-Intelligence. And he says that, you know, we have to always keep in mind that AI is not like other software, and we shouldn't judge it that way, but we should figure out how to use it in a different way. So it's not going to give us the perfect results all the time. So, and that shouldn't mean that we dismiss it, but we should really rethink, what does that mean? Like, what should we use it for? That's the Swiss Army knife idea, right? And then, apart from your organization's guardrails about data confidentiality and stuff like that, don't worry too much about tool choice, because you can always switch. This is not like introducing a CI/CD system where, you know, a year later you have to do a big migration project to move all your pipelines from one to the other, right? These tools you can use today, and you can just stop using them tomorrow. And then finally, as I said before, I think as a profession, we have to reflect on our practices. I really believe these tools are here to stay, but there are a lot of questions still open of how we can better use them. So this talk was mostly focused on tools, but there's like a lot else to talk about, of course. I have kind of like an imperfect way here. I put a gist on my GitHub handle is Birgitta 410, and I put a gist on there with all of the links from the talk, but I also published the slides somewhere. And that was it. Thank you.